"Sir, the owner doesn't live like this." The words landed in the cold night air like a quiet verdict, calm but final, the kind of sentence spoken by someone who believed they already knew the truth. Marcus Ellington stopped just short of the iron gate, the gravel beneath his shoes crunching softly as he shifted his weight. For a moment he didn't answer. The driveway stretched behind the gate for nearly 200 feet, curving through trimmed hedges toward the tall glass front of the mansion, glowing warm with amber light. The house looked exactly the way he remembered it before his trip. Soft lights along the stone walkway, the tall oak tree swaying gently over the fountain, the brass address numbers reflecting the porch lamps. Everything was familiar. Everything was his. And yet here he stood on the outside of it. The security guard stepped forward, a tall man with a square jaw and a dark jacket marked security across the chest. His name badge read Brad Coleman. The beam of his flashlight moved briefly across Marcus's coat, his travel bag, his tired face. It was the kind of quick scan someone gives a stranger who doesn't belong somewhere expensive. Behind him 2 other guards watched quietly, arms folded, posture stiff with the certainty that their leader had already handled the situation. Marcus breathed in slowly. The night carried the faint scent of wet grass and polished stone, the kind of calm quiet that usually welcomed him home after long flights and longer meetings. Tonight the silence felt different, like a locked door that hadn't existed yesterday. "I'm going inside," Marcus said finally, his voice steady, almost gentle. "You're standing in front of my driveway." Brad didn't laugh, but the corner of his mouth lifted slightly, the kind of expression that said he had heard stories like this before. "Sir, I'm going to need you to leave the property." The words were polite, rehearsed, but firm. Marcus glanced past him through the iron bars of the gate. The front door stood exactly where it had always stood, framed by tall white columns and the soft yellow glow of recessed lights. A place he had imagined for years before he could afford it. A place he had signed for with his own name. A place he had walked through 1,000 times. Tonight it felt a mile away. "You're new here," Marcus said quietly. Brad didn't deny it. "I know who lives here." Marcus nodded once. He had expected that answer. Wealthy neighborhoods had a rhythm to them. Delivery trucks arriving at the same time every morning. Gardeners trimming hedges with quiet precision. Security teams rotating every few months when contracts changed hands. Marcus had spent years building companies that ran on systems just like that. Efficient, organized, predictable. Except systems only worked when people looked closely enough to see what was actually in front of them. A light breeze moved across the driveway, rustling the leaves above the fountain. Somewhere deeper on the property a motion sensor clicked softly as it adjusted to the wind. Marcus shifted the strap of his bag over his shoulder. 20 hours of travel sat heavy in his bones. He had landed an hour ago, declined the driver, and taken a quiet ride back because sometimes he liked arriving home without ceremony. Just the sound of gravel under the tires and the quiet glow of the porch waiting for him. But tonight the ceremony had arrived anyway. "Sir," Brad said again, the patience in his voice thinning slightly. "The homeowner is not expecting visitors." Marcus let the sentence hang in the air between them. Visitors. The word drifted across the driveway and settled somewhere strange in his chest. For a second he said nothing. He simply looked at the gate, at the iron bars polished smooth, at the brass plate beside the keypad. His name was engraved there in clean capital letters. Marcus Ellington. The metal reflected the porch light like a small, quiet mirror. Brad followed his gaze but didn't seem to notice the plate. Or maybe he saw it and didn't connect it to the man standing in front of him. That was the strange thing about assumptions. Once people believed them, they stopped looking for anything that proved them wrong. Marcus finally reached into his coat pocket. Not quickly, not angrily, just a slow, deliberate movement, the kind someone makes when they have already decided how the night will end. His phone rested in his palm, the screen lighting softly in the darkness. Behind the gate the mansion stood silent and warm, unaware that its owner was still outside waiting to come home. Marcus looked at the house one more time, then lifted the phone and calmly tapped a single contact. Marcus Ellington held the phone calmly against his ear while the quiet hum of the estate surrounded him, the distant fountain whispering behind the iron gate, and the wind moving through the tall oak branches above the driveway. For a moment the line rang, steady and patient, the soft digital tone blending with the night air. Marcus stood still, shoulders relaxed despite the long day that still lingered in his bones. 20 hours of flights, 2 airport terminals, and nearly 4,000 miles of travel had led him back to this gate. Yet the weight he felt now had nothing to do with distance. Brad Coleman watched him closely from the other side of the iron bars. The guard's posture remained firm, but curiosity had begun to replace certainty in his expression. Most people who showed up at this address claiming ownership did not look calm. They raised their voices, waved their hands, tried to argue their way through authority. Marcus did none of those things. He simply stood there with quiet patience, the soft light from the security lamp brushing across the edges of his coat and the faint silver at his temples. "Sir," Brad said again after a moment, folding his arms across his chest, "whoever you are calling is not going to change the fact that this is private property." Marcus did not respond immediately. The call connected, and a familiar voice answered on the other end, steady and alert even at this hour. "This is Eleanor Whitmore." Marcus's voice lowered slightly, warm but composed. "Good evening, Eleanor. I apologize for the late hour." On the other end there was a brief pause. Then a hint of surprise softened her tone. "Marcus? You are back already." Marcus glanced once more at the house glowing beyond the gate. The wide glass windows reflected the porch lights like small pools of gold. "Yes," he said calmly. "I arrived earlier than expected." Eleanor Whitmore had managed the Ellington estate for nearly 12 years. She had watched the house rise from architectural sketches to the finished stone structure now standing behind the gate. She knew every hallway, every garden path, every contractor who had set foot on the property. If there was one person who understood exactly who belonged there, it was her. "Is everything all right?" she asked. Marcus took a slow breath. "There seems to be a small misunderstanding at the front gate." Brad shifted slightly as he heard the words misunderstanding and gate spoken in the quiet night. Marcus continued in the same, even tone. "Your new security team is doing their job with great confidence." Eleanor was silent for half a second longer than usual. When she spoke again, her voice carried a sharper awareness. "Are you telling me they have not let you in?" Marcus allowed the faintest smile to cross his face, though Brad could not see it clearly from the other side of the bars. That would be an accurate description of the situation. The wind moved again across the driveway, brushing the hedges with a soft whisper. Behind Brad, one of the younger guards glanced toward the house, as if expecting someone to appear on the porch. Eleanor's voice returned, calm but now edged with disbelief. "Marcus, please stay where you are." Marcus nodded gently, even though she could not see him. "I had no intention of going anywhere." The call ended with a quiet click. Marcus lowered the phone and slipped it back into his coat pocket. For several seconds nothing changed. The gate remained closed. The driveway still curved toward the glowing house. Brad cleared his throat and straightened his stance again, as if trying to reclaim the authority he had held only moments earlier. "Sir," he said carefully, "I do not know who you spoke to, but until I receive direct confirmation from the homeowner or the estate office, the gate remains closed." Marcus looked at him with calm eyes that carried neither frustration nor anger. "That is reasonable," he said quietly. The younger guard beside Brad frowned slightly, glancing again toward the house. Something in Marcus's tone had shifted the atmosphere at the gate. The certainty that had once filled the air now felt thinner, like fog beginning to lift. Marcus rested his hands loosely in the pockets of his coat and waited. The night remained still for nearly 30 seconds. Then, somewhere deeper inside the property, a porch light flicked brighter. Moments later the front door opened. A narrow line of warm light spilled across the stone steps as a tall figure stepped out onto the porch, pausing only long enough to glance toward the gate before beginning to walk quickly down the curved driveway. The figure moving down the driveway walked with surprising speed for someone her age. Her dark coat pulled tightly around her shoulders as the porch light stretched her shadow across the stone path. Eleanor Whitmore had managed this estate long enough that even the night seemed to recognize her authority. The gravel shifted beneath her shoes as she moved past the hedges, the faint sound echoing toward the gate where Marcus Ellington stood waiting. Brad Coleman noticed her first. His shoulders straightened slightly as he recognized the estate manager approaching, though the uncertainty in his expression deepened with every step she took toward them. Eleanor Whitmore rarely came outside at night, unless something serious had happened. The younger guard beside Brad leaned closer and whispered quietly, "Is that Mrs. Whitmore?" Brad nodded once without taking his eyes off the approaching figure. Marcus watched her calmly from the other side of the gate. The warm porch lights reflected faintly in the polished iron bars between them, but his attention remained steady on the woman walking toward the entrance. He had known Eleanor long enough to recognize the quick rhythm of her stride. She was not walking casually. She was moving with purpose. Within seconds, she reached the final curve of the driveway where the gate controls stood mounted beside the stone pillar. The motion sensor light above the keypad brightened as she approached, illuminating the brass nameplate fixed to the stone wall. The engraved letters gleamed clearly in the light. Marcus Ellington. Eleanor paused only long enough to glance at the nameplate before lifting her eyes toward the man standing outside the gate. The moment she saw him, the tension in her posture dissolved into immediate recognition. "Marcus," she said firmly, her voice carrying across the iron bars with unmistakable certainty. Brad blinked once, then again, as if his mind needed a moment longer to process the scene unfolding in front of him. Eleanor stepped closer to the keypad panel beside the gate and pressed the intercom button. The quiet hum of the speaker came alive. "Mr. Ellington," she continued with calm professionalism, "welcome home. I was not expecting you until tomorrow afternoon." Marcus gave a small nod, the faintest smile returning to his face. The meeting in Seattle ended earlier than planned. Eleanor looked briefly toward Brad and the other guards standing beside the gate. The expression on her face did not show anger. It showed something far more unsettling for the men listening nearby. Absolute clarity. She turned the key inserted into the security override slot, and the iron gate released with a soft mechanical click. The heavy bars began sliding open slowly along the track in the driveway. The sound was quiet but unmistakable. Brad's posture stiffened as the realization settled over him piece by piece. The man he had stopped, questioned, and instructed to leave was now being welcomed through the gate by the person who managed the entire estate. Marcus stepped forward as the gate opened wide enough to pass through. The gravel shifted softly beneath his shoes as he crossed the threshold onto the driveway. For a moment he paused just inside the entrance, glancing once toward the brass plate mounted beside the keypad. The engraved letters reflected clearly under the security light, bright and impossible to ignore. Brad followed his gaze and finally saw what he had overlooked earlier. His eyes lingered on the nameplate for several seconds before lifting slowly toward Marcus again. Eleanor Whitmore stepped away from the keypad and walked toward Marcus with composed efficiency. "Your luggage," she said, gesturing lightly toward the bag resting near his feet. "Shall I have someone bring that inside?" Marcus lifted the bag himself and shook his head gently. "That will not be necessary." Eleanor nodded once. Then she turned slightly toward Brad and the other guard standing silently beside the entrance. The quiet driveway seemed to grow even stiller as the night air settled around them. The fountain deeper in the garden continued its soft, steady rhythm, the only sound breaking the silence. Eleanor folded her hands calmly in front of her and looked directly at Brad Coleman. Her voice remained polite, but the authority behind it was unmistakable. "Mr. Coleman," she said evenly, "I believe we need to discuss the terms of your security contract." Brad Coleman felt the weight of the silence settle around the driveway, like a pressure he could not step away from. The iron gate had already slid fully open, resting quietly against the stone wall as if it had always belonged there, as if it had never stood between Marcus Ellington and the home behind it. Yet the moment lingered in the air, heavy and unmistakable. Marcus adjusted the strap of his travel bag and walked a few steps farther up the driveway, the gravel shifting softly beneath his shoes. He did not hurry. He did not look back immediately. The house stood ahead of him, tall windows glowing with warm light, the polished stone entrance reflecting the soft illumination of the porch lamps. The place looked exactly the same as it had when he left 3 days earlier, but the feeling of crossing that gate tonight carried a quiet gravity that even the wind seemed to notice. Eleanor Whitmore remained near the entrance beside the security controls, her posture straight and composed. She watched Marcus for a moment as he walked several yards ahead, then turned her attention fully toward Brad and the 2 guards standing beside him. The younger guard shifted his stance, glancing uneasily toward the open gate, and then toward Marcus's back as he moved deeper along the driveway. Brad, however, remained still. His expression had changed in a way that was difficult to describe. The certainty he carried earlier had faded, replaced by the slow realization that the situation had unfolded far differently than he had assumed. Eleanor spoke again, her voice calm but precise. "Mr. Coleman, when did your team begin their assignment here?" Brad cleared his throat quietly before answering. 3 days ago, ma'am. Our firm was contracted at the start of the week." Eleanor nodded slightly, as if confirming a detail she already knew. "Yes," she said thoughtfully. "Your firm replaced the previous team on Monday afternoon." The younger guard shifted his weight again, the faint crunch of gravel beneath his boot breaking the stillness for a second. Eleanor's eyes moved briefly toward the brass nameplate mounted beside the gate control panel. The polished surface reflected the security light clearly, the engraved letters bright and unmistakable. She looked back at Brad. "During your orientation," she continued evenly, "were you informed of the ownership of this property?" Brad hesitated for the first time since the conversation had begun. The pause was small but noticeable. "We were given the address and the security protocol," he replied. Eleanor tilted her head slightly. "But not the name?" Brad looked once more at the brass plate on the stone pillar, and the answer arrived too late to change anything. Marcus Ellington had already walked nearly 30 yards up the driveway. He paused briefly beside the fountain near the oak tree, setting his bag down for a moment as he stretched his shoulders after the long flight. The quiet water moved gently beneath the stone edge, reflecting the porch lights in soft ripples. Behind him, the conversation at the gate continued. Eleanor's voice remained steady. "Security exists to protect a home," she said calmly. "But protection requires awareness." Brad lowered his gaze slightly. The younger guard beside him avoided looking at anyone at all, his attention fixed somewhere on the driveway stones. Eleanor folded her hands lightly in front of her coat. "This property belongs to Mr. Marcus Ellington," she said clearly. "He is the owner of this estate, the person who approved the contract your company now operates under, and the individual you instructed to leave the premises." The wind moved gently through the hedges lining the driveway, carrying the quiet sound of the fountain toward the gate. Brad exhaled slowly, the realization settling fully now that the moment could no longer be misunderstood. Marcus picked up his travel bag again and began walking toward the front steps of the mansion, his pace unhurried, his posture calm. Eleanor watched him for a moment, then turned back toward the security team one final time. "Mr. Coleman," she said with composed clarity, "before the evening goes any further, I believe it would be wise for you to contact your supervisor." Brad Coleman remained beside the open gate for several seconds after Eleanor Whitmore finished speaking, the quiet instruction lingering in the air heavier than any raised voice could have been. The driveway lights hummed softly above them, casting pale reflections across the polished iron bars and the brass plate fixed to the stone pillar. Marcus Ellington was now nearly halfway to the front steps of the mansion, his figure moving calmly through the soft glow of the garden lights. He did not turn around. He did not watch what happened behind him. The sound of water from the fountain carried gently across the yard, steady and indifferent to the tension gathering near the entrance. Brad finally reached for the radio clipped to his jacket, but his hand paused before touching it. The younger guard beside him shifted again, his eyes moving between Eleanor and the man walking up the driveway. "Brad," he murmured quietly, "should we call headquarters?" Brad inhaled slowly through his nose, the cool night air settling in his chest. "Yes," he said at last, though the word came out softer than he expected. Eleanor watched without interruption. Her expression remained composed, but the clarity in her eyes made it obvious that the situation had already moved beyond simple explanation. Brad lifted the radio and pressed the call button. The device crackled softly before the line connected. "Central," he said, his voice measured but noticeably tighter than earlier that evening. "This is Coleman at the Ellington property." A brief pause followed, filled only by the quiet hum of the driveway lights. Then a voice responded through the speaker. "Go ahead, Coleman." Brad glanced once toward the brass nameplate beside the keypad, then toward Eleanor Whitmore, standing calmly beside him. The realization he had been avoiding all night finally settled in fully. "We have a situation regarding property access verification," he said carefully. The words sounded formal, but even he could hear the uncertainty beneath them. Meanwhile, Marcus Ellington reached the wide stone steps leading to the front entrance. The tall glass doors reflected the porch lights like sheets of gold across the polished surface. He set his travel bag down briefly and rolled his shoulders again, easing the stiffness left by hours of airline seats and airport corridors. For a moment, he simply stood there, looking at the house he had built piece by piece over the last decade. The columns rising beside the entrance had once existed only in architectural sketches. The oak tree beside the fountain had been planted the same month the foundation was poured. Every inch of the property carried a quiet memory of work, patience, and long years of decisions. Tonight, standing just inside the gate, those memories felt sharper than usual. Behind him, the conversation at the entrance continued through the faint crackle of the security radio. "Clarify the issue," the voice from headquarters said. Brad swallowed once before answering. "The homeowner has arrived unexpectedly." The line went silent for a moment. "That is not an issue," the supervisor replied. "Homeowners have access to their own property." Brad shifted his weight on the gravel, the faint crunch echoing in the quiet yard. Eleanor remained still beside the control panel, listening without a word. Brad forced himself to continue. "The homeowner was previously denied entry due to identification uncertainty." The silence on the other end of the radio stretched longer this time. When the voice returned, it carried a sharper edge. "Denied entry by whom?" Brad closed his eyes briefly before answering. "By my team." Another pause followed, longer and colder than the one before. The younger guard beside him stared down at the ground, as if the gravel itself had suddenly become fascinating. Marcus lifted his travel bag again and walked the last few steps to the door. Eleanor Whitmore had already activated the entry system remotely, and the lock released with a soft mechanical click as he approached. The door opened smoothly beneath his hand, warm air from inside the mansion drifting out into the night. Before stepping through, Marcus paused and glanced back toward the gate once more. From the distance, he could see the 3 guards standing beneath the security light and Eleanor Whitmore beside them, her posture still composed, her presence steady as ever. The radio crackled again. The supervisor's voice returned, quieter now, but unmistakably serious. "Coleman," he said slowly, "stay where you are. I will be reviewing this situation immediately." The line went silent again. Marcus stepped inside the house, and the door closed gently behind him, leaving the open gate, the quiet fountain, and the uneasy security team standing alone in the driveway beneath the pale light of the night. Marcus Ellington stepped into the quiet warmth of the mansion and closed the door behind him with a soft, deliberate motion that echoed gently through the wide marble foyer. For a moment he stood still, letting the silence settle around him. The house carried the familiar scent of polished wood and fresh linen, the same calm atmosphere Eleanor Whitmore maintained with quiet precision every day. The chandelier above the entrance cast a warm golden glow across the polished floor, reflecting faint patterns of light that stretched toward the curved staircase. Marcus set his travel bag beside the entry table and loosened the collar of his coat. The long journey still clung to his shoulders, but the tension from the gate had begun to fade into something quieter, something more reflective. Outside, nearly 70 feet away at the open entrance of the property, the night air felt heavier for the 3 security guards standing beside the iron gate. Brad Coleman held the radio loosely in his hand, the earlier confidence in his posture replaced by a stiff stillness that even the cool breeze could not break. The younger guard beside him kept glancing toward the driveway, his eyes moving back and forth between the mansion and the stone pillar where the brass nameplate gleamed beneath the security light. Eleanor Whitmore remained near the keypad panel with her hands folded calmly in front of her coat. She had not moved since Marcus walked through the gate. Her presence was steady, almost immovable, like part of the estate itself. The quiet sound of the fountain drifted through the garden again, water slipping over the smooth stone edge in a steady rhythm. Brad finally lowered the radio to his side. The conversation with headquarters had ended only minutes earlier, but the weight of those last words continued to echo in his mind. "Stay where you are." Reviewing immediately. The sentence had been calm, yet it carried the unmistakable tone of someone already drawing conclusions. Brad shifted slightly on the gravel and glanced toward Eleanor Whitmore. She met his look without hostility, but there was no uncertainty in her expression either. "Mr. Coleman," she said evenly, How long have you worked in private residential security? Brad cleared his throat quietly before answering. 8 years. Eleanor nodded once, acknowledging the number as if measuring its meaning. 8 years is a long time to observe how people behave around wealth, she said. The younger guard lifted his eyes slightly, listening now despite himself. Eleanor continued in the same calm tone. You begin to recognize patterns. Certain cars, certain clothes, certain ways people carry themselves. Brad said nothing. The night air moved through the trees again, rustling the leaves softly above the driveway. Eleanor glanced briefly toward the mansion, where the front lights still glowed warmly across the tall windows. The difficulty with patterns, she said quietly, is that sometimes they teach people to stop looking. Brad's shoulders stiffened slightly at the words, though he did not interrupt. Inside the house, Marcus walked slowly through the foyer and into the living room overlooking the front lawn. The tall windows framed the driveway below like a silent photograph. From this distance, the figures near the gate appeared small beneath the security lights, standing beside the iron bars that only minutes earlier had separated him from his own property. Marcus rested his hand lightly against the back of a chair and looked out through the glass. He did not feel anger. What he felt was something more complicated, something older than tonight. The memory of other doors, other rooms, other moments where someone had looked at him, and quietly decided he did not belong there. Outside, Brad exhaled slowly. Mrs. Whitmore, he said carefully, I was following protocol. Eleanor inclined her head slightly. I believe you were. The younger guard looked up in surprise at her answer. Eleanor's voice remained calm. Protocol exists for a reason, she continued, but it also requires judgment. The security lights hummed softly overhead. Brad glanced again toward the brass nameplate on the stone pillar. The engraved letters reflected clearly beneath the pale glow. He had walked past that plate several times during his shift earlier that evening without really seeing it. Now the name seemed impossible to ignore. Marcus Ellington. The wind moved through the driveway once more, carrying the quiet sound of the fountain and the distant creak of the oak tree branches. Eleanor Whitmore looked back toward the mansion again, where Marcus stood behind the glass windows watching the driveway in silence. Then she returned her attention to the guards beside the gate. Mr. Coleman, she said calmly, your supervisor will arrive soon. When he does, it will be important that everyone here understands exactly what happened tonight. The night deepened around the Ellington estate, the quiet rhythm of the fountain continuing beneath the tall oak tree while the driveway lights cast pale halos across the gravel. Inside the mansion, Marcus Ellington remained near the tall living room windows, his silhouette calm against the warm glow of the interior lights. From 70 feet away, he could still see the small group standing near the open gate. Eleanor Whitmore had not moved. Brad Coleman and the two guards beside him stood in the same positions they had held for several minutes, the silence stretching long enough that every small sound carried across the lawn. Then, from beyond the hedges lining the road outside the property, a pair of headlights appeared. The beams swept slowly across the iron gate and the stone pillars as a dark sedan approached along the quiet residential street. The engine slowed, and the car turned smoothly through the open entrance, tires rolling carefully across the gravel driveway. Brad straightened immediately when he saw the vehicle. He recognized it even before the headlights dimmed. The sedan belonged to the regional director of the security firm that had taken over the Ellington contract earlier that week. The car came to a gentle stop beside the gate, and the driver's door opened. A tall man in his early 50s stepped out, adjusting the sleeve of his coat as he looked toward the entrance of the property. His name was Daniel Hargrove, and he carried himself with the practiced confidence of someone who had managed hundreds of security assignments across the country. Yet the moment he saw Eleanor Whitmore standing beside the gate, his expression shifted slightly. Mrs. Whitmore, he said as he walked closer, his voice respectful but cautious. Eleanor inclined her head politely. Mr. Hargrove. Brad remained silent beside them, his posture rigid as Hargrove's attention moved from Eleanor to the three guards standing near the pillar. The director's eyes narrowed slightly as he studied the scene. The open gate, the uneasy silence, the brass nameplate gleaming under the security light. He did not need long to understand that something had gone very wrong. Explain, Hargrove said quietly. Brad swallowed once before speaking. Sir, the homeowner arrived unexpectedly and attempted to enter the property. We were unable to verify his identity at the time. Hargrove's gaze shifted slowly toward the mansion in the distance. Through the tall windows, he could see the warm lights glowing inside the house. And the homeowner, he asked carefully, is currently inside the residence? Eleanor answered before Brad could respond. Yes, Mr. Ellington is inside. The director's shoulders lowered slightly as the full meaning of the situation settled over him. For a moment he said nothing. The sound of water from the fountain continued to drift across the garden, steady and calm against the tension now hanging over the driveway. Hargrove finally turned toward Brad again. Did you read the orientation briefing for this property? Brad hesitated. The question felt simple, yet it carried an edge that made the silence between them sharper. Yes, he answered, though the word came out less certain than he intended. Hargrove glanced once more toward the brass plate mounted on the stone pillar beside the gate controls. The engraved name caught the light clearly. Marcus Ellington. He exhaled slowly. That name, Hargrove said, gesturing toward the plate, is the first line in the briefing document. The younger guard beside Brad lowered his eyes again, the gravel beneath his boots suddenly fascinating once more. Eleanor Whitmore remained still beside the keypad panel, her presence calm but unmistakably firm. Hargrove rubbed his forehead briefly, the quiet gesture revealing the frustration he had kept hidden since stepping out of the car. This estate, he continued carefully, is owned by a man who built 3 technology companies and employs thousands of people across the country. When he arrives at his own front gate, the correct response is not confusion. Brad looked down at the gravel, the earlier certainty gone completely now. The director let the silence linger for a moment longer before speaking again. Mr. Coleman, he said evenly, you and your team will remain here until I complete my report. Inside the mansion, Marcus Ellington stepped away from the window and moved deeper into the quiet living room, the soft carpet absorbing his footsteps. Outside near the gate, Daniel Hargrove looked at the 3 guards one final time before turning toward Eleanor Whitmore. His voice lowered slightly when he spoke again. Mrs. Whitmore, he said with quiet seriousness, I believe the contract for this team will need to be reconsidered. Eleanor nodded once, her calm expression unchanged as the driveway lights continued to glow above the open gate. The quiet after Daniel Hargrove's words lingered across the driveway like the stillness that follows a bell long after the sound has faded. The open iron gate stood motionless beside the stone pillars, its shadow stretching across the gravel under the pale security lights. Brad Coleman remained exactly where he stood, though the confidence that had filled his posture earlier in the evening had dissolved into something much heavier. The younger guard beside him shifted his weight again, the faint crunch of gravel echoing softly in the silence. Eleanor Whitmore observed the scene without raising her voice or changing her calm expression. She had spent decades managing large estates and complicated people, and she understood that moments like this did not require dramatic words. They required clarity. Daniel Hargrove slipped his hands into the pockets of his coat and looked once more toward the mansion in the distance. The tall windows glowed warmly against the night sky, a quiet reminder of the person who owned everything within those walls. Mr. Coleman, he said at last, his voice steady but unmistakably firm, I want you to walk me through exactly what happened when Mr. Ellington arrived. Brad inhaled slowly, feeling the cool night air fill his lungs before he spoke. He approached the gate on foot carrying a travel bag. He began. He stated that he lived here. Hargrove nodded slightly. And what did you do next? Brad looked briefly toward the brass nameplate mounted beside the gate controls before answering. I asked for identification. Did he provide it? Hargrove asked. Brad hesitated again. No, he admitted quietly. Eleanor Whitmore glanced toward the mansion, where the warm light continued to spill through the tall windows. Marcus Ellington had disappeared deeper into the house minutes earlier, leaving the driveway to settle into its own quiet reckoning. Hargrove continued the questioning with measured calm. Did you consider the possibility that the owner might not be carrying identification after traveling? Brad lowered his gaze. I believed verification was necessary before granting access. The director studied him for a moment. Verification is necessary, he said, but recognition is equally important. The breeze moved gently through the hedges lining the driveway, carrying the faint scent of damp grass across the garden. The fountain continued its steady rhythm beneath the oak tree, a quiet reminder that the estate itself remained unchanged by the tension unfolding near the gate. Hargrove stepped closer to the stone pillar and rested his hand lightly beside the brass nameplate. The engraved letters reflected the security light clearly, each character sharp against the polished metal. "Mr. Coleman," he said quietly, "how many times did you walk past this name during your shift tonight?" Brad did not answer. The younger guard beside him stared down at the gravel again. Hargrove looked back toward Eleanor Whitmore. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said respectfully, "I believe you mentioned that Mr. Ellington approved this contract personally." Eleanor inclined her head. "Yes. He reviewed the security proposals last month before selecting your firm." The director nodded slowly as the full weight of the situation settled into place. "Then it is my responsibility to correct this immediately," he said. The driveway lights hummed softly above them. Hargrove turned his attention back to the three guards standing near the gate. His voice remained controlled, but there was no uncertainty left in it now. "Mr. Coleman, your team's assignment at this property ends tonight." The words landed quietly, but with unmistakable finality. The younger guard lifted his head slightly in surprise before looking back down again. Brad closed his eyes for a brief second, the reality of the decision arriving all at once. Hargrove continued in the same calm tone. "You will remain here until the replacement security team arrives. After that, you will report to the regional office in the morning." The breeze moved through the driveway again, rustling the leaves of the oak tree overhead. Eleanor Whitmore remained composed beside the keypad panel, her presence steady as ever. Inside the mansion, Marcus Ellington walked slowly through the long hallway leading toward his study, the soft carpet absorbing his footsteps as the events of the evening faded into the quiet comfort of the home he had built. Outside near the open gate, Daniel Hargrove glanced once more at the brass nameplate shining under the security light before turning back toward the driveway. The estate returned to silence, but the lesson from the night lingered in the cool air long after the conversation had ended. The estate settled into a deep quiet after Daniel Hargrove's decision, the kind of stillness that seemed to absorb every lingering sound. The open gate remained fixed beside the stone pillars, the iron bars reflecting the pale security lights above the driveway. The fountain beneath the oak tree continued its gentle rhythm, water sliding over smooth stone as if the night itself had chosen to move on. Brad Coleman stood where he had been told to remain, his shoulders stiff, his eyes drifting once more toward the brass nameplate mounted beside the keypad panel. The engraved letters reflected clearly beneath the steady light. Marcus Ellington. It was the same name he had passed earlier that evening without truly seeing it. Now it seemed impossible to ignore. Daniel Hargrove stepped away from the pillar and walked a few yards toward the center of the driveway, glancing once more toward the mansion in the distance. The house stood tall and quiet, its windows glowing warmly against the dark sky. Inside those walls, the owner of the estate had already moved on with his evening, leaving the rest of the scene behind him. Eleanor Whitmore remained beside the gate control panel, her posture unchanged, her calm presence steady as ever. She had witnessed countless negotiations, contracts, and decisions during her years managing the property, but moments like this reminded her that the most important lessons rarely happened inside boardrooms. They happened quietly, in places where people revealed how they truly saw the world around them. Hargrove finally turned back toward Brad and the other two guards. His tone remained professional, but there was a firmness in his voice that left no room for misunderstanding. "The replacement team will arrive shortly," he said. "Until then, the gate remains open and Mrs. Whitmore will oversee the entrance." Brad nodded once without lifting his eyes from the gravel. The younger guard beside him shifted again, his earlier confidence replaced by an uneasy silence. The driveway lights hummed softly overhead as the breeze moved through the hedges along the property line. Several minutes passed with no one speaking. The quiet allowed every small detail of the estate to settle into place again. The sound of distant crickets beyond the garden wall, the faint rustle of leaves above the fountain, the warm glow of the mansion windows reflecting across the polished stone steps. Inside the house, Marcus Ellington had reached his study, a quiet room overlooking the front lawn through tall glass panes. He rested his hand briefly against the back of a leather chair and looked out toward the driveway once more. From this distance, the figures near the gate appeared small beneath the security lights, standing beside the entrance where only an hour earlier he had been asked to leave. The memory of that moment lingered in his thoughts, not with anger, but with a quiet understanding. Success had opened many doors for him over the years. Yet moments like tonight reminded him that sometimes people still looked first at the person standing outside the gate rather than the name engraved on the stone beside it. Marcus exhaled slowly and turned away from the window. The study carried the quiet comfort of familiar things. Shelves lined with books he had collected over decades. Framed photographs from the early days of his first company. The large oak desk where countless decisions had shaped the life he now lived. Outside, near the gate, Daniel Hargrove checked his watch as headlights appeared again on the road beyond the hedges. Another vehicle approached the property, its beams sweeping briefly across the iron gate before turning into the driveway. This time the sedan carried the replacement security team assigned to the estate. Eleanor Whitmore stepped forward to greet them calmly as they exited the vehicle, already prepared to explain the transition that would take place before the night ended. Brad Coleman watched quietly as the new guards took their positions near the entrance. The open gate remained exactly where it had been all evening, but the atmosphere around it had changed completely. The driveway lights continued to glow above the stone pillars, illuminating the brass nameplate that reflected clearly against the night. Marcus Ellington, a simple name carved into metal, yet one that carried the story of a man who had built everything beyond the gate through years of patience and work. The fountain whispered steadily beneath the oak tree while the estate returned to its calm rhythm. And in the quiet glow of the security lights, the lesson of the night remained etched in the cool air long after the final shift change had taken place.